G'day YouTubers, how you all going? My name's Wilfred West, Wilfred's PC World, Lakeside Cottage in Locksport, Victoria, Australia. Today's date is the 19th of the 3rd, 2015, and it's 9:33, and it's 20 degrees at the moment. Now, I'm just testing out this new mount, as you can see here. I'll do a quick zoom in here. I'm just curious in how it's going to, how stable the pitch is going to be. As you can see how it's wrapped around there, it's an interesting one. It's just eventually I want to get on the camera, or maybe another two cameras. I'll put one in here at the back or on the side there, and then have one at the other area, because normally I'd have it mounted here on this bracket here. Alright, which is quite good, but you can't have it up too high because the area. I might have to lift that bracket up actually. Anyway, we'll go have a quick drive around Locksport, and we'll see how it looks, shall we?
The metadata that was accessed today could have been used in civil litigation against customers of ISPs. This amended bill limits the access to serious criminal law enforcement. Also, the original bill provided no right for individuals to access their own metadata. This amended bill, as a result of one of the recommendations of the PJIS ICS inquiry, does allow people to access their own metadata, and this bill implements a mandatory data breach notification system, which again protects the rights and provides information for customers of ISPs. The cost is yet to be fully disclosed by the government, although it's estimated that the capital cost of the scheme will be anywhere between $188 million and $300. Labor has very, very clearly insisted from the beginning that the cost of this scheme should not be borne by small businesses and by households and customers. The cost should not be borne.
It's going to be borne by bloody individuals.
Costs should be borne by the government. And yesterday in this Parliament, we had once again the next round of the political stunt that is the government's
I love this.
repeal day. Well, if the government is serious about removing red tape and about reducing costs on small businesses in this country, they will not impose the cost of this scheme on consumers.
They will be imposed. Small businesses, and it will be on individuals, because the government likes to screw everybody over.
Is given an oversight role under this legislation, and originally the government was proposing that the Ombudsman play this role, but without the additional resources to perform what will be an additional task for the Office of the Ombudsman. So Labor has secured not only the oversight role,
and over the last 9 or 10 months where we've been gripped by this issue, at no point in time was the government able to clearly articulate to the Australian people the amount of data that is currently stored by telecommunications companies including internet service providers and others. Deputy Speaker, at no time during the debate have they pointed out this data in many respects is already stored, and what their original proposal was trying to do was to put in place a standard regime for storage of this data. Deputy Speaker, at no point during the debate did they point out that at the moment there are thousands and thousands and thousands of applications per year to access the details of that metadata. I'm advised that in 2012-2013 alone, that over 320,000, Deputy Speaker, over 320,000 applications were made by law enforcement agencies and other government authorities for access to the data which is subject to this debate before the House today. Some of those applications for data, indeed over 1/3 of them, I'm advised, Deputy Speaker, came from the New South Wales Police Force. Some of those applications were for a good cause, and I don't think there is any right-thinking member of this House or in this country who would disagree. For example, when the Victorian Police Force were trying to track down the person who was responsible for that grisly murder of the ABC journalist Jill Marr. Nobody, no right-thinking person would have criticised the Victorian government for using metadata to be able to match up the location of the perpetrator and the locator of the location of the victim in the one vicinity, and therefore being relatively quick in being able to track down the man who was subsequently found guilty of that horrible murder. Deputy Speaker, no right-thinking person would say that is an inappropriate use of our law enforcement access to that metadata. That was not explained sufficiently, Deputy Speaker, and as a result there's been enormous misunderstanding about it. Now I've said that I've pointed this out, Deputy Speaker, as a very valid use of our law enforcement agency of access to metadata. Of course, we can all point to, or many of us can point to, equally dubious ways to access that metadata, Deputy Speaker. We've heard of examples of Queensland Police spying on contained employees.
You're listening to ABC News Radio. It's 9:45 Australian Eastern Daylight Time to Sexton with you. We're broadcasting from the House of Representatives, and we're in the middle of the second reading debate of the Telecommunications Interception and Access Amendment Data Retention Bill 2014 and the amendment moved by Greens MP Adam Band. With the call at the moment, Shadow Assistant Minister for Health, Stephen Jones.
Models, wrappers and other litter around the streets of the municipality. I'm sure there are a lot of people who look at those sorts of vehicles and scratch their head and say, is this the intention? Where is the national security imperative allowing access to data for these sorts of purposes? So Deputy Speaker, the complete offhanded mishandling of this debate has allowed misunderstanding, and it has also meant that the focus has been on the wrong issue. Because as I've already said, I've had a long history of dealing with telecommunications companies in this country, Deputy Speaker, in many different places. And I know that billing rates and for resolving disputes between wholesalers.
Welcome back, YouTubers. As you can see, I put the camera in a different spot of the car. Yeah, I'm just testing out this camera and we'll see how we go. Can't see. Oh, I can barely see it now. But with my sunglasses, I can't see that. Reverse camera.
Which resulted in almost 550,000 exposures of telecommunications data. So in this kind of broadly unregulated or poorly regulated environment, 500,000 records were accessed. And I think just that fact alone, Deputy Speaker, illustrates a very clear need for us to tighten up what is going on out there in the world of data retention. Now, I think it's also an important place to start this conversation talking about the other values. So obviously there's issues of being an unregulated environment, but what we've heard from the Australian community, I think quite rightly, is that there are civil liberties concerns with how the data is being regulated and accessed at the moment. We know that privacy is an important right of ordinary Australians, and as a starting point we should say that no one should have access to anything that anyone does in their personal lives unless there's some other countervailing principle that we're weighing against it. Privacy is not just important because it's a private right, but of course we know that privacy is critical to the functioning of our democracy. Journalists need to be able to protect themselves and protect their sources. We know that activists and dissidents have perfectly entitled to organise against, to criticise security agencies and other sorts of things. And I very much respect those things, and they must be protected. So this is what we're balancing against the need to potentially access this data. So from that starting point, we've got these very valuable private rights and civil liberties. So we need to understand whether there is a clear need in that case for those types of principles to be balanced against another need. So should the right to privacy be modified in this instance? I think that the PJCIS, which looked at this bill in an incredible amount of detail, it has an excellent chapter on this very question, and I really encourage those in the community who have shown an interest in this issue to have a look at the chapter. What we know is that telecommunications are creating new types of crimes, and they're also creating a means for us to resolve very old types of crimes. And we've seen that very much in recent criminal investigations, criminal activity of recent years. So we know, for example, that data retention can be an essential tool in fighting online pedophilia and online sex crimes. We know that terrorism is often organised online, so there's obviously going to be an element of metadata being used to resolve those. But also, and I note the Melbourne courts raised the example of Jewel Marr and the woman in Melbourne who was very tragically killed. And we know that metadata was essential in tracking down the person who committed that crime. I know that the Blaxland also talked in his speech on this subject about the fact that it's become very routine now when someone is found to have committed a crime. One of the first things that police will want to do is go back through and work out who that person most recently spoke to and try to piece together elements. So I think there's very clear and very obvious needs for anyone who knows anything about how police pursue crimes these days that indicate that there is a need here. And in the submissions to the inquiry into the bill, we saw very clearly that there are a wide range of people who acknowledge this need to curtail the right to privacy in order to assist us in fighting crime. So I don't want to overstate that. There are lots of people, of course, who don't believe that there's a need to make many interventions, but there are lots of people who thought there are. So, for example, Professor Gillian Triggs, who is the President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, she talked in her submission about the need to update the law to reflect the fact that there is an obvious new tool to fight crime, and that this is a good reason in some instances to curtail the right to privacy. Even Timothy Pilgrim, who is the Australian Privacy Commissioner, talked in his submission about the fact that the right to privacy is not absolute and that he sees that there are some clear needs to curtail that right, given what we know about the importance of metadata in fighting crime. So from my point of view, reading some of these submissions has helped me come to the view that it is very important that we try to better regulate this area, and that access to metadata does need to be allowed under some conditions. Now, some of the other speakers have talked about the role that Labor has played in making this legislation into what we believe is a good and decent piece of legislation. Where we started on this bill, I think we've had broad acknowledgement was not a great place to start. I think we even saw that from the people that proposed the bill in the House, that there was a real need for the Parliament to look closely at the legislation and to improve on it. And I'm actually very proud of the work that Labor has done through the parliamentary process. There are some in the community who would have liked to see a sort of stand-up fight on this one a little bit, but we actually see that this is a very serious issue. It needs serious consideration, and that's why we have used the Parliament to make this bill into something that we feel that it strikes the appropriate balance. So I'd like to explain just briefly some of the things that Labor has pushed to change in this bill that I believe have allowed it to strike that right balance. The first one of those is that under the legislation we're debating now, the definition of data is actually included in the substantive legislation itself. That sounds very technical, but really what it means is under the previous version of this, the Attorney General could, through regulation, change the definition of data. This is important because the definition of data, as I've explained, does not include things like the list of websites that you visited. It doesn't include things like the text of email. And we believe that should be enshrined in legislation, because if there is anyone in Australia who wants to have a discussion about whether that should change, we believe that that discussion should take place here in this chamber, and that we should all get to have a say in it rather than allowing the Attorney General to have the right to make that change on his own. The second is limiting the list of agencies who can access that data. Again, under the previous version, this was not in the substantive bill. So what we have said is that if the government of the day wishes to make a change to the agencies that are allowed to access metadata under the legislation, they will now have to come back into the Parliament to do that, and the Attorney General is not going to be allowed to add agencies as he or she sees fit. The third thing we have done, which I think is tremendously important, is allow a provision in the legislation so that individuals can now access their own metadata. And I think if we are going to infringe on the right to privacy to a degree, I think it's only fair that people understand what it is that other agencies might have access to. So we've made sure that that's enshrined in the legislation. Another point is about how this data is protected. So because of Labor's actions, the data that is being retained by telecommunications companies will now be encrypted. We've added an oversight mechanism into the bill, so after 2 years of operation, the PJCIS, which is the committee that considered this legislation in detail, will have the chance to go through and look at how it's been operating, consider how the data has been accessed and whether the use of such data is appropriate. So to all of those in the Australian community who have a strong view about how this legislation has panned out and the version that's gone to the Parliament, I just say to you, you will get another chance to talk about this when we see in practice how the legislation is used and if there are any improvements to it. Another issue that I would just mention is that through the committee process, Labor was able to ensure that metadata can only now be accessed for criminal matters. And this is quite important, Deputy Speaker, because as I've said, it's been difficult to strike that right balance between the right to privacy and the benefits in crime fighting that we see through the use of metadata. And we believe that the right to privacy should only be infringed to this degree when there are criminal matters at stake. So, for example, this idea about the Game of Thrones problem, so people were concerned that online piracy might be apprehended through this process. Because of Labor's intervention, that's not what this legislation is about. We're not trying to oversee people's activities to that degree, but where there is a criminal matter to be answered and a criminal matter to be considered, we believe it's fair that the right to privacy be curtailed in this instance. I don't want to state that this is a perfect piece of legislation, and I hope that the remarks that I've made give the indication that we've thought about it and there are remaining issues. The way that the legislation treats journalists is a remaining issue. That was not an issue on which the committee process could reach an agreement. Labor has pushed this very hard, and we're continuing to push very hard on this. And those who have been following the debate closely will know that Bill Shorten, the member for Maribyrnong and the Leader of the Opposition, is continuing to push this with the Prime Minister, and I hope to see that matter resolved. I just also mentioned that we shouldn't see this piece of legislation in isolation. Something else that the Labor Party is interested in pursuing is looking, as we give security agencies more powers, into how we can ensure that there is appropriate parliamentary oversight for those different agencies. And that's something that Labor will be pursuing in the coming months. So, Deputy Speaker, I'm pleased to support the bill, which I believe strikes the right balance, and thank you for the chance to make comments.
The question now is that the amendments be agreed to, and I call the Honourable Member for Macon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'm pleased to follow the member for Hotham in this debate. Mr Deputy Speaker, I well understand that many legitimate concerns that people have about this legislation, and so does the Labor Party understand those concerns. Indeed, many of the concerns...
This is Tony Zappia, Shadow Parliamentary Secretary for Manufacturing.
...legislation, but equally apply with respect to the current process that we have in the management of metadata. Were it not for this legislation and the processes that the Parliament has gone through in recent months, the existing flawed, insecure and unaccountable practices would continue, and they would continue without any discussion whatsoever.